Hi,
Hi,
Robin.
Mellody. Hi, how you doing?
Let me introduce myself to the audience. My name is Dr. Mellody Hayes. I'm an anesthesiologist, speaker, and the executive director of Ceremony Health, a psychedelic medicine clinic that is a nonprofit clinic that's located in Berkeley, California. I am excited to be here today with Robin Carhart-Harris, amazing clinical researcher. He started out as a doing psychoanalysis and also training in psychopharmacology. And now he is the head of the Center for Psychedelic Research from the Imperial College of London. Robin, thank you so much for being here today.
Pleasure, Mellody. Yeah, really pleased to be here.
Of course, normally City Arts and Lecture, the initial original plan was for us to meet on stage in San Francisco, but because of COVID, I'm delighted to meet you remotely.
Yeah, it's a, not
So
as special, but still, yeah, this is nice.
This is nice. This is nice. Less jet lag for you coming from London.
Yeah, right. Yeah, be loaded up in coffee by this point, I think.
Yeah. So, Robin, I live in San Francisco, where I am in between Burning Man and Silicon Valley, and psychedelics are such a part of the culture of creativity and productivity here. But for those who are tuning in who may not know about psychedelics, can you start by giving us a bit of an overview to what are these medications? What are these substances?
Sure. So, first of all, you could think of some examples. That's probably the quickest way in. LSD. Everyone's heard of LSD, the prototypical psychedelic discovered in the 1940s by Albert Hofmann. And in the 1950s, we have the first reference to or use of the term psychedelic. It was coined by a British psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, actually working in Canada. And the term psychedelic, the word itself, was invented to refer to drugs like LSD, and it means to reveal the mind or the soul. So that's what we have. Drugs like LSD, psilocybin, which is found in magic mushrooms. You have DMT, found in ayahuasca, this Amazonian brew. You have mescaline, used for generations in the Americas, and then you have this somewhat abstract term, psychedelic, mind revealing. We could also put a scientific spin on a definition, talk about the serotonin system and how these drugs work in the brain. And in a sense, we might get a clearer biological definition then of what psychedelics are. But I think for the general public to hear that the principal property of this class of drugs is to make accessible to conscious awareness aspects of the mind that are ordinarily hard to access or almost impossible to access is the key defining property of this class of drugs.
So one of the things that you said, mind manifesting, or previously I've heard you describe as soul manifesting. And so these substances, just to summarize, make aspects of the soul, make aspects of the mind accessible. And so how is this different from, say, because one of the reasons that we're so excited about psychedelics is because we're able to use them for novel treatment indications, for treatment-resistant depression, for anxiety, for PTSD. And as an anesthesiologist, I'm really excited about the pipeline possibility for chronic pain. Really powerful indications for those. So can you tell me more about the clinical indications, and also why do these work differently from SSRIs or other traditional medications that we have?
Yeah, sure. And I think I probably could tie it in with the term itself, mind revealing, soul revealing. How could a drug that has these properties be therapeutic? And so if we think about, a lot of the disorders that you described there, that they're all either showing some preliminary evidence in clinical research of the potential to be treated effectively by psychedelic therapy, or there's good theoretical reasons to think that they could be effectively treated, then what's a common denominator here to these different expressions of psychological suffering, if you want? And what I would suggest there is that when we when we suffer anguish, trauma, uncertainty, anxiety, then we often try to adapt to that situation by developing some kind of defensive mechanism. And typically, what that does to our mind and our bodies is to root it, to root those things in a particular way. For example, if our suffering expresses in depressive symptoms, our minds are rooted in a very pessimistic view. It's usually internally focused. It's full of negative reflections, ruminations on the self, how worthless we are. It's energy sapping, but it's all about this kind of narrowing, of thinking and behaving. And we could take another example, chronic pain. This psychological component of the pain, that we are someone with intractable, ongoing pain, that there's no hope for me, and it becomes so stamped in that it becomes more just than the bodily pain. It's this all-encompassing, I have chronic pain and it is torture, or addictions, these habits of behavior as much as habits of mind. And so all of these disorders, I think, do have that commonality of entrenched habits of mind and behavior. Now, a mind revealing substance might open up the mind, might broaden the landscape, broaden the perspective. Perhaps in that action of opening up, we might be able to see a broader perspective, to be able to take an overview, to see the bigger picture, perhaps put our pain in a context, perhaps put our depression in a context, our addiction in a context, perhaps understand how we got there, that maybe we got there because we're trying to sort of self-medicate to treat some underlying basal, pain, uncertainty, anguish. And so really, in a sense, that's the model. It's about this opening up. But the key thing with psychedelic therapy, and I emphasize therapy there, is that you're not just taking a drug. It's not just a simple medicine. Doctor prescribes it, chuck it down your throat, makes you better. It's about giving something of yourself. It's about setting a certain intention. It's about contextual manipulation. That you're in a particular setting, you close your eyes, you have compassionate beings with you, guides, therapists who sit with you, you have music that you listen to. It's all about this kind of package of care done, in that context of opening up, that seems to be the vehicle that can be effective.
I would, Reverend, you're bringing up so many things. I'm so excited. So I said that we have some time to dig in, because I would like to invite you to talk about a bit more about the therapy. And this mode of treatment is novel in that we are going beyond just a primary biological monoamine deficiency theory of wellness and health. And really, there's an experience of connecting with intention and, frankly, I might say spirituality that's offered through this treatment. Can you talk a little bit more in depth about the therapy and the role of intention and therapeutic relationship?
Yeah, sure. And this, picks up on another aspect of your previous question about how's this different to SSRIs. That SSRIs, they work on the serotonin system in the brain as psychedelics do, but they seem to work on it in a different way. In some sense, a kind of cruder way, a broader brush way, where they generally increase serotonin functioning, you might say. And serotonin is this really rich, complex neuromodulator in our brains. That, how do I break that down? Well, it modulates or tweaks the functioning of the mind and the brain. But that includes a lot of different things. It's somewhat imprecise in its action. And if you were to really drill it down, you might say SSRIs work to just take the edge off things, smooth out the creases, the ups and downs of life, and they make it somehow easier to get by. There's less of like this heavy dysphoria, and it's just somehow easier to get by. With psychedelics, and tying in with the therapy now, it's much more about a an opening up again, and the drug itself works now on the serotonin system in a bit more of a specific way than SSRIs. It activates a certain aspect of the serotonin system, and that aspect is related to learning, it's related to adaptability, it's related to plasticity, which is what it sounds like. It's the ability to change, to be malleable. And so psychedelics enhance that. And so that suppleness of mind and being that psychedelics promote, it's then about harnessing that in a therapeutic way, a little bit like a child. An infant is incredibly plastic, incredibly, ripe for learning. And what do we want to do with an infant? Well, we love it. We try and nurture it. We try and give it the best possible conditions. And it's a similar principle with psychedelics. You have a very vulnerable being, hyperplastic under the drug, and we try and channel them with compassionate, supportive care in a healing direction.
I love hearing you say this, and what is coming for me, it's a beautiful model of kind of birthing into life a new person from the therapy. I trained with MAPS, which is a company that provides, is developing MDMA, and I trained in the training for people of color. And the therapeutic framework that was put forth is almost like these two ideal parents in a way who are coming together, providing you this moment of exposure to an opportunity to be loved and to develop a new new brain that is experiencing neuroplasticity. And then from emerging from that, being washed in love, being washed in care, people who have been experiencing PTSD for years in a state of hyperactivity have long going remission from symptoms. And I just love your description of this mind that is now able to receive love and take in care in a different way and be in the environment in a different way. Can you talk? I love research, and I also love story and narrative. Can you share a individual patient story of someone who you've treated, so that we can understand really what does this transformation and what do the treatment outcomes look like in an individual life?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's so many, so many souls, and it feels like that, doing this work. It's been a bit of a while since I've been on the ground doing the actual sitting, but I was present for all of the sessions in our first depression trial that's published on. We've recently completed a new one, which perhaps I'll tell you about later. But if I go back to that earlier trial, gosh, there were so many. I mean, there's a lot of tears, It's so leveling, it's this beautiful leveler, where and the wisdom that comes from somebody under the influence of a psychedelic might be, that might sound very surprising to the average person who hasn't studied these compounds or had an experience with them, that someone would be almost in a state of heightened clarity under a psychedelic. They might think, LSD, don't you think you're going to fly and you could jump off buildings and all that kind of nonsense? But this wisdom that you see in people, and gosh, I mean, there were so many that were powerful. I could think of one individual who had, to his credit, opened up in the preparatory work, told us about some awful trauma that he'd suffered, abuse, sexual abuse, and so that added, that kind of added a charge to the therapy as we went into it, and it came up, and I remember sitting with him, with the co-therapist, holding his hand. We were both holding his hand, as this just incredibly powerful music played. Greg Haynes was the artist, and he was weeping, and he was being told to sit with it, to go with it. And the catharsis that was playing out there, the release, it was such a powerful moment, spine tingling. And I think we were all tearing up during that experience. So beautiful, so human, so connecting. Gosh, there's so many, but I think that release, that openness, that unguardedness, and how difficult is it to do that ordinarily, just to let all the defenses go, and confront, your abuser in a way. And he said that it wasn't entirely just a clear and simple forgiveness. It was more like he understood a kind of pity towards the abuser, that how sad is it that this person performed such actions, how tragic, and so there was pity there. And what incredible strength and humanness to someone who messed up your life, essentially, to feel that, and to see the chain of sort of suffering and infliction of pain, and be in a position where you can work towards ending that chain, is such a privilege to be witness to something like that.
I just feel moved just hearing that description, but also what hearing that description highlights that I want to share with the audience is that these profound moments that are typical of psychedelic therapy, these profound moments, patients describe them as like years of therapy consolidated in this one intense experience. And it often provides individuals with an opportunity to set off on a new life course, meaning that rigidness, that defensiveness that they once were in, now they find that they are online and available for love. Or if I will share a little bit about my own experience. I experienced my own experience of physician burnout and underwent medical treatment with psychedelic therapy. And it was such a profound opening in my own experience. It has really inspired my work in this area and completely changes your ability to express love and receive love. Just so softening us and returning us to our human experience. I love the story you're telling me is one that I've heard over and over and over again. One of the questions I have for you is, you talked a bit about neuroplasticity. Can you go talk more about that, just for a lay audience to understand, what does it mean to be able to create a new mind that is more neuroplastic?
Yeah. I guess, one thing you can do with plasticity to make it more intuitive is to think about sensitivity to learning, really. And one can imagine how that's especially sort of intense early on in life as we're just mopping stuff up. But another way to think of plasticity is that when we have learned stuff and stuff has become entrenched and drilled in, then in a sense certain things can become overlearnt and overlearnt in a way that is actually not a good reflection of the way things really are. And these defensive mechanisms that you see in depression are a really good example of that. We've shown, as others have shown, that depression isn't an example of a clearer perception of reality. That notion of depressive realism, that the depressed person actually sees things as they really are, and the rest of healthy society are kind of wildly optimistic and have their heads in the clouds. That's not true. When you're depressed, when you're thoroughly depressed, you're almost delusional. You are just seeing this very negative way, outlook on life, that only bad things are going to happen to you, that there's no point in anything. And it's not accurate. We've measured that. You measure it by predicting future life events and then seeing whether they happen. And what you find is this skew, where this massive pessimism bias. So these things become, pathologically learnt. These beliefs, these habits become overweighted. Plasticity, a state of heightened plasticity, is also an opportunity to unlearn such things. It's not just about learning; it's also about a suppleness in which you can unlearn. And quite why it is and why it happens that psychedelics, taken in the right way, with a supportive context where you're encouraged to let go and open up, quite why it seems to recalibrate people, resettle people in a healthier way, is still a matter of some uncertainty. But it does seem to do that, So these heavily weighted patterns become relaxed, and in that window of opportunity, and in the window of opportunity afterwards, because there's good reason to think that there's also this, what we call subacute plasticity, or after the event plasticity, like a residual plasticity, that you have an extended window of opportunity to do further work, and so this theme of the integration work that comes after the event, after the ecstasy, the laundry, Jack Cornfield. It's so important.
Yes. So this is the work, talking about after the ecstasy, the laundry, meaning the work of integration.
Yeah.
When you have this mountaintop experience that's frequently occasioned with psychedelic medicines, and there's this great opening, people get access to emotions that they may have never really had access to before. They feel their heart, they feel their sensitivities. And when I interviewed a lot of people who experience psychedelics to get a better understanding, especially for people of color, what do these medications provide for an experience of liberation and healing? I remember one police officer who underwent treatment for PTSD told me that he could feel the air on his skin, and that level of sensitivity, that heightened sensitivity. So there is a heightening of sensitivity in this process of integration, and there is work to be done with it. Can you talk a little bit more about the process of integration with psychedelic therapies?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's something that we're realizing we need to test better. It's largely an assumption that it's important. I mean, one thing I could say to it, that first of all, what is it? I mean, it's an opportunity to process. It's about landing. You might have had an experience on one of these substances where it felt like you were in communion with, the oneness of consciousness, the essential kind of, I don't know, the divine, and whatever it is. People commonly report this, these very profound, mystical type spiritual experiences, a sense of connection, and an essential, fundamental nature to existence, the fundamental nature of love, and whatever it is. And as hard as it is to describe it and define it, people report it. And we also find that if you have it, you have better outcomes. However, the experience can be so big that people are kind of shocked, and they just don't know what to do with this. Like, one minute they were getting on with their 9 to 5, and now they have had their whole belief system just turned upside down. And it's just, how to kind of land from this is so difficult. And so, first of all, it's just that opportunity for space and time to talk it through, And I think if it's not talked through, then there's a danger that you're left with your head in the clouds, in a sense, and it's difficult to ground and go back to everyday life. So there's a danger of perhaps a kind of escapism that could happen through that. This notion of spiritual bypassing, that rather than doing some of the work, as you say, some of that laundry, the difficult work that comes
Mhm.
after the ecstatic experience. You just want the ecstasy. And psychedelics don't generally seem to promote a kind of addictive behaviors, but even if it's just a kind of deep dive into spirituality, that is potentially being, it's a subtle one, but being done as a kind of escape rather than a really sitting and dealing with some of the difficult stuff. Yeah, I think integration, the real value of integration is to continue some of the difficult work, actually.
Mm.
And to realize that the learnings go on. It's not just one shot. No, I get it, I'm enlightened. It's that people forget. You might in the moment realize the cycle of suffering and the illusory nature of self and all that kind of thing, but stuff happens and you just forget. Life happens and you forget. So that principle of continuing the work, continuing the learning, this overlaps very strongly with spiritual practice. And
Mm.
there it's strongly emphasized. You don't ever stop meditating. It's all about practice. And it's like exercising like an athlete. You have to keep returning, and exercising that muscle of kind of mindfulness and the slowing down and the centering. Otherwise, we just get caught up in busy modern life and we forget. So all of those things are related to this broad brush term of integration.
So one of the things I heard you say was these substances, these medications are not addictive, which is wonderful news. And they are largely physiologically safe, non-addictive and physiologically safe. However, you talked about the risk of spiritual bypass, meaning wanting to stay in a spiritual state and maybe not do the laundry, not do the work. In addition to that, are there other dangers or concerns that you have about psychedelics that people should be aware of about psychedelics?
I mean, that's a kind of subtle one, the spiritual bypassing. I think it's probably worth saying that it's probably more the exception than the rule. Sometimes it happens, and it's a subtle one. But I think generally speaking, most people doing psychedelic therapy are very well intentioned and they know that the work needs to be done. Other risks, the experience itself has to be put down as risky, and that's why when we talk about psychedelic therapy, we talk about therapy and we talk about having a safe container. We talk about rapport building, preparation, getting to know the individual. Building that relationship of trust, trying to, promote an attitude of letting go, surrender, confrontation, willingness to go there. And that safe therapeutic container, if that's not there and someone, takes a high dose of LSD at Burning Man without thinking about any of these things, or worse, is spiked, at Burning Man, and they didn't even know that the drink contained a big dose of LSD, then they could easily have a hellish experience, characterized by just psychological struggle and I'm going mad, and if they don't understand what's happened, then it's very easy for them to create, delusional defense mechanisms to try and make sense of all that craziness. A scenario like that, you won't have the integration, you won't have the landing, you won't have the support. And so it's those worst case scenarios where very, very rarely, but you do hear it in that sort of recreational context, if you want, that sort of, that we talk about drug abuse, that's abuse of psychedelics, is taking them outside of that therapeutic context. My view is that whenever anyone takes a psychedelic, whether they realize it or not, they're doing therapy, because the drug sort of forces it on you. It's just intrinsically psychologically agitative, opening you up, a classic psychedelic anyway. And so that's a risk if you don't it's like the yin to the yang. You can't separate the two. You can't, in my view, microdosing for me is taking these tiny doses as a way to almost bypass the work potentially, unless it's done with the work. And yeah, so I think these are the two sides of the same coin. You have to have the therapy there when you have psychedelics, and whether you realize it or not, the substance is intrinsically going to exacerbate and exaggerate and catalyze therapeutic processes. So, for example, if you have defense mechanisms, as most people do, then they're going to be agitated, and it's better to be prepared for that and willing to open to that and work on those things.
So in summary, psychedelic assisted therapy, very safe, but you would say that there is risk if someone's taking these at a party without any kind of therapeutic support.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say that psychedelic therapy is very safe, because first of all, you have very vulnerable people. And so even with the best possible preparation, and also very complex people sometimes, people are generally complex, but, grades of that. And so it's not always, one shot solution, a magic cure. So it's not without risk, but risk is very much mitigated by doing it therapeutically. And we could talk about the benefits, which these, psychedelic therapy can truly be life-saving for so many people. So
yes, very much so life-saving. These for people who have treatment-resistant depression, which means that they failed every other SSRI and every other class of medication and might be living with daily suicidal intent. These treatments like ketamine can immediately stop suicidal ideation. These therapies can be so profoundly effective. You talked about microdosing. I just want to address with the audience what that word means.
Sure.
Normally, a therapeutic dose of a substance is a full dose, but with a microdose, people might take a 10th, a 20th of that normal dose every 2 to 3 days and call that a microdose. So instead of having this moment where with psychedelics, there's this moment where your brain is kind of flooded. The system is flooded such that the default mode network or your ego construct can go offline. In this higher dose state, the ego construct that's telling you that you're worthless and iterating those ruminative thoughts, those cease completely. And in this moment where the ego is offline, people often have experiences of ecstasy, which are those loving voices that say that we're okay, that we are one, and that you are loved, and coming back into an experience of love. And that is, the research shows that the best evidence for therapeutic effect is when people get to those places that are a spiritual or transcendent experience.
Yeah.
However, microdosing, again, taking 1/20th or something of the dose, you're arguing does not invite people into this vulnerable, open state that allows them to do the work.
Yeah. I mean, of course, all rules could be challenged, and someone might say, well, when I microdose, I twin it with meditation, I twin it with spiritual practice, and it lubricates me and does actually open my heart, but I just don't know whether that's the general rule. I think there is a danger with microdosing that people think, oh, I can get the good stuff, as in the therapeutic effect or like a creativity enhancement with the psychedelic, without having to go through all that scary, weird psychedelic stuff, And so the truth is that, as we know in all sorts of contexts, it's a zero-sum game. There's no free lunch. With every up, there's a down. And so, there's no such thing that it's an easy ride to therapeutic benefit. In fact, there's some literature, some evidence to suggest that microdosing can be psychologically agitative,
Mm-hmm.
And also we've got data in-house, and we've seen data elsewhere that suggests that there's a large placebo component to microdosing, that if the idea is that you take a dose that is so small that you don't feel it, well, we know, very well in clinical research that the placebo effect, if you compare it to SSRIs, is actually the majority of the effect. Placebo's here and SSRIs only just beating it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite possible that a large part of the microdosing effect is just driven by positive expectancy. So there's a lot of unanswered questions when it comes to microdosing. I think it's taken off, probably because it can feel quite nice to do,
Mm-hmm.
and so a lot of people do it because, like I said, you get some of the interesting stuff without the scary stuff. But I'm not, I'm not convinced on its therapeutic value unless it's twinned with something like a structured spiritual program or practice or therapeutic program
Mm-hmm.
or course. Yeah.
And I think the subculture of microdosing and around psychedelics is, I think there's this idea that there's this panacea, meaning there's a way to smooth the ride and maybe not have to do the work. And this is really important to note, that this is a very powerful treatment for certain indications, but it doesn't do everything. And even as we are within the medical community, we're extremely excited about the new indications for possible, even psychedelics are being researched for diseases as varied as Parkinson's disease. And I actually understand that you have new research happening at your institution with anorexia.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So we've just got it through the ethics approval process, which generally speaking takes about a year to get through. And actually that has been more or less our experience, maybe a little bit longer. I think maybe the pandemic had something to do with that. And we're virtually through that very long and arduous bureaucratic churn that happens with clinical research in general, but throw in a Schedule 1 substance there and it's extra hard. Mm-hmm. So we're through that, which is great, and we're kind of quietly celebrating that. We're now recruiting. We want to bring in a couple of people with eating disorder expertise. Some psychotherapy experience is important, and so we're looking to kind of staff up. We have great therapists in house, but we want to bring in that eating disorder expertise as well. And so the model there is coming back to what I was saying earlier in terms of the what you might call transdiagnostic therapeutic potential of psychedelics, that they could treat a lot of different expressions of psychological suffering. There may be kind of a consistent root core, which is like trauma, complex trauma, anxious uncertainty, and our makeup, but then it's a defensive response. You root in a particular way. Someone suffering from anorexia is trying to control their bodies by not eating, and there's this excessive cerebral component where the mind is very strong and firm and controlling, and the body is suffering as a result. There's a lot of self-loathing and sort of self-punishment, guilt, and such like. But that control, that heavy top-down control, is a major part of it, and that's what's affected by psychedelics. With a high enough dose, and there may be a paradox here. We're not sure, but there may be a paradox here, where actually these people with very small BMIs, body mass index, very very light people are actually less sensitive. You might think someone so small would be more sensitive to the drug effects, but perhaps because of their biological and psychological makeup, they're so controlling that even with a big dose of a psychedelic like psilocybin, magic mushrooms, they can somehow, they're resistant. But the model is that, with a high enough dose, there's an irresistible force that kind of forces an opening up. And then again, in those conditions of compassion and non-judgment and mindfulness, that you can sit with your condition, sit with yourself, work through the suffering, and then, come out the other side, and then hopefully carry on the work and cultivate the wellness, into the long term. That's the model. We're not the only ones trying this. Hopkins are a couple of patients into doing another trial, anorexia, psilocybin therapy for anorexia. So, different people are having similar ideas. It's a really great collaborative spirit among the academics in this space. And we talk to Hopkins, they help us. So, we'll give it a shot. And it's such a tragic disorder, anorexia, the most fatal psychiatric disorder. And young people, so much scope for good when current treatments seem to be pretty ineffective. It's a pretty desperate situation for anorexia. So risky, but, the potential for benefit there is huge. So fingers crossed that it goes well.
That sounds like amazing work. And beyond the psychological suffering, anorexia, has very high mortality. It can have high mortality when untreated. So, and I understand what you're saying, that it's not the weight of the person, but it's almost the strength of that mind, the attentiveness of the mind. I find I can tell how the dose of the medication, that when people's habits of mentating, even for the anesthetic that I need to provide for them, their habits of mentating can be so strong that require a higher dose. But really excited about that work in that area with eating disorders. Do you have any? I read your lovely and wonderful article most recently in The Guardian, and it really was a commentary on the endemic rates of mental illness, both in the US and the UK, and the increasing rates of distress that people are expressing in the setting of COVID. And COVID means that our social isolation, our economic distress, and there's ways in which class inequality are really positioned to increase greatly. Can you comment on, in the setting of just how much we are collectively suffering, can you comment on when in the UK additional therapeutic options such as psychedelics might be available for people?
Yeah, it's difficult to forecast when this will get through, and that's one of the really difficult things at the moment, is that the proper approach is to say, look, everyone, let's be patient, let's do the research, let's get it to hopefully get it to the public by really demonstrating in a compelling way that this is safe and effective. But then the other side of it is that there's so much demand, so many people suffering, and like you said, with the pandemic, there's been a spike in something that was already, a serious, burden on so many levels. The mental health crisis, as people say, and just an intensification of that with all the socialization, the uncertainty, the economic pressures, the familial pressures, the lockdown, the social pressures, and so all this demand, and that's being reflected in prescription rates of SSRIs. They've gone up, I think, 20% or over 20%, and so that's a difficult situation to be in, where you're a researcher and you're chipping away, doing your little studies, 20 patients, all we've done in depression, TRD, yet seems to have had, really big impact. And people are, I can understand it, particularly when it literally can feel like your life depends on getting access to this treatment, but the access isn't there. In fact, the access is illegal, and you could go to jail from trying to save your life. Or you think, well, I'll go to another country, I'll go to the Amazon, it's legal there, I'll go to Amsterdam. But most people can't afford that. And also, if they're chronically depressed or anxious, they're not going to do that, because it's so scary. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And I wish I had the solution. And all I could say is, we'll keep chipping on, chipping away. But the other people who are trying to drive this to licensing, the likes of MAPS, you have Compass Pathways, USODA, and then you have some of these other initiatives that might open things up. This is the noble endeavors. They're really to be respected. All this hard work, it's all mission driven, as far as I can tell. And long may it last. I mean, you spoke about some of the risks about psychedelics. I slightly worry, and others do as well, about commercial pressures somehow derailing this mission-driven aspect of psychedelic medicine. One of the wonderful things that I'm seeing presently is most researchers and most people in the field are kind of wise enough to see that, a profit drive and be like, no, it's about something much more than the dollar,
Yeah. When we talk about the suffering that's happening, and again, the increased rates of alcoholism that are happening in the middle of social isolation and COVID, sometimes, looking at the ramifications of alcoholism in a family and the immense benefit from the research literature around LSD and alcohol and alcoholism, sometimes I'm just like, I feel such grief because I feel that people may not have an illness. They just may not have an access to a therapy that really works for them. And to be able to, there is a lot of goodwill and social support. Most of the funding for your institute, for MAPS, is all from goodwill philanthropic endeavors. And MGH also, one of the Harvard hospitals, now has a new psychedelic research center. So this is coming online more and more. In parallel with, I believe there's still a lot of people who are outside of the medical community who are working through decriminalization in relationship with their states to try to bring these medicines to the public in a way that's culturally appropriate and safe. Ahead of time, we asked the audience for some questions, and so I want to take a moment to field some of the audience's questions. Thank you so much for this time.
Oh, thank you, Mellody.
Oh my gosh, so excited about this and such important research. So my first question is from an audience member who says, how important or helpful is combining psychedelic treatment with other forms of therapy, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy?
Yeah. It's been done a couple of times, a couple of studies, the addiction studies, Matt Johnson with smoking addiction, nicotine addiction, tobacco addiction. And I think Michael Bogenschutz as well in his work on alcohol dependence with psilocybin. The psilocybin sessions have been twinned with supplementary motivational therapy. And that they particularly Matt Johnson's study in tobacco addiction, the outcomes were remarkable, like 80% abstinence in his first study. Yeah, you just don't see that with other treatments.
Nothing else.
No, it comes close to that. So intuition says that that's a great model. I know of others now looking at things like acceptance and commitment therapy, others looking at mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Really exciting opportunities there. Very much fits that model of a residual plasticity being harnessed, the openness that's been produced by the experience itself now being harnessed post-acutely after the experience to try and sustain the wellness. We haven't done that so well in our research. I think it's fair to say, put our hands up and say we haven't done that so well. So, I would love to see that, to try and, sustain the wellness, the staying well, the resilience component with that supplementary treatments. And there are certain models that seem to work or intuitively seem to fit that idea particularly well. Acceptance and commitment therapy, all about, sitting with one's pain and working through it, committing to healthy behavioral change. Similar with mindfulness, sitting with non-judgment and such like. So yeah, huge potential there. The research is just starting, I think it's fair to say, but intuition says that model could really work very well.
Another question is, how do the dosage and manufacturing process of creating psychedelics affect the individual response? And this may be a question as well to address the difference between a biological or plant-based substance and a pharmaceutically derived substance.
Yeah. Well, some people might argue that there's more to the mushrooms than just psilocybin, for example. So when we do our clinical work, we give synthesized 100% pure psilocybin. It's the chemical within the magic mushrooms that seems to produce the psychedelic effects. Others might say, well, there's other stuff in there by cysteine. I forget his name. It's the kind of thing I'd want to defer to Paul Stamets on, who's a true mushroom expert. But when I've asked Paul about this, he said that, you know, the evidence that anything else is really contributing substantially isn't that compelling. And so it does generally seem to be psilocybin and psilocin that is working and doing the psychedelic effects. Also, you have less of the organic matter in there, so any of the gustatory issues, the intestinal issues that you might have through ingesting mushroom materials seems to be bypassed by taking pure psilocybin. So I don't think it's a problem to be taking the synthesized psilocybin. However, psychedelics, because the model is sort of quintessentially holistic, it's about this, you know, mind body bridging and therapy and a drug action. It does invite a broader holistic view. You know, plant medicines, these are things that have been used for generations. They grow out of the ground. And so I'd say absolutely, I agree with all of that. But I do think there's something to be said for scientific discovery, and that the evidence seems to suggest that it seems to be, at least if we're talking about mushrooms, it's the psilocybin and the psilocin that's really doing the action that's important here. So part of the thinking about plant medicines might be more about sort of the psychological component, the cultural component that you bring to an experience. Some people might think, I want the plant stuff. I don't want the synthesized stuff. I like nature. You know, that's how I want to take my food and drugs. And I would say, okay, but that's largely a sort of psychological assumption here. And MDMA doesn't occur naturally. And it seems to have, you know, very impressive therapeutic effects when twinned with psychotherapy, PTSD.
It's a very novel place. This is one of the questions we had. It's a very novel place to be doing research in this highly academic setting that's really married to the relationship to spirituality, to love, and to wellness. Meaning, can you comment a bit on how to I guess we're talking about the mind-body connection, but the being in a very technical, using fMRIs and MEG imaging, but trying to document this experience of transcendence and being in an area of research that's really invites people into spaces that maybe are normally discussed in Buddhism or spiritual communities.
Yeah, for me, that's one of the most exciting things about psychedelics, if not the most exciting thing, that there is the potential through psychedelic science to almost validate spiritual practice, spiritual experience, you know, spiritual insight and wisdom. You might think, well, we don't need brain imaging to do that, you know, but I actually tend to think that it can kick it along a little bit. You know, if we understand something about what's going on in our brains when we have a unitive experience, a profound sense of interconnectedness, not just our brains, but our brains and our bodies, then that's potentially, you know, a wonderful advance. And it's not going to kill any of the wonder. It's not going to kill any of the magic in a poetic sense. For me, it will extend and advance the wonder. We'll feel even more, wonder and gratitude for the incredible nature of nature if we understand its nature
Mhm.
better. And so that's the quest of a scientist, really, is to better understand the universe and nature. I think sometimes people could think that there's something almost disconnecting about the scientists, in their white coat with their gloves on, this thing over here, this object of study. But that's just a kind of that's just an image, an archetype, if you want. Really, I think, especially a biological scientist, but I would say any scientist is on a quest to just better understand nature, and nature extends to the universe, not just the Earth. Um, so yeah, it's a I think it's quite a noble pursuit and a privilege to be part of.
Well, Robin, I want to thank you for not being a disconnected scientist. it's been it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you and sharing this wealth of information. I really appreciate both your excitement and passion for the topic and how we're able to get this information about the possibility of new treatments. And in this setting of COVID, I just wanted, before we end, I want to give you express gratitude and also just send safety and wellness to your family and your community. May everyone
Thank you,
be well.
Mellody. I appreciate that, and same to your family as well.
Thank
Be
you.
lovely to meet you and chat with you.
Very nice to meet you as well.